Hi, I'm Summer Carrington, and I am 29 years old. My grandfather's funeral was supposed to be about honoring his legacy, but instead it turned into the most embarrassing day of my life. I sat and watched my family tear apart his estate with greed, while I got handed a note with a mysterious 10-digit phone number and the chilling instruction: call this number by 6 p.m. Don't be late. When I called the number, the voice I heard left me stunned. The reading of grandfather's will took place in the drawing room of his Greenwich estate. My father sat with his arms crossed, already calculating. My mother dabbed at tears that never quite reached her eyes. My sister Amanda perched on the sofa edge, whispering to my two brothers, Andrew and James, about what they hoped to receive. My aunt and uncle completed the circle, both wearing expressions of barely concealed anticipation. Mr. Williamson, the family attorney we'd known for years, cleared his throat and began reading. To my son, Richard Carrington, he began, I leave controlling interest in Carrington Shipping, valued at approximately $42 million. My father's face lit up. He'd been waiting for this moment his entire life. To my daughter-in-law, Victoria Carrington, I bequeath the Greenwich estate and all furnishings, valued at $18 million. My mother actually smiled, a rare occurrence. To my grandsons, Andrew and James Carrington, I leave my collection of classic automobiles and the penthouse in Manhattan, valued at $12 million, to be split equally. Andrew pumped his fist under the table. James nodded, satisfied. Then Mr. Williamson paused. He looked directly at me, and I saw something in his expression. Was it pity? Sympathy? I couldn't tell. To my granddaughter, Summer Carrington, I leave this sealed envelope with specific instructions for her eyes only. He handed me a small cream-colored envelope. That was it. Just an envelope. The room erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Well, my mother said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, I'm sure there's something meaningful inside, dear. Perhaps a nice letter about how much he loved you. But I could see it in their faces. They thought it was hilarious. Poor Summer, who'd spent every holiday with Grandpa, who'd listened to his stories, who'd been his supposed favorite, left with nothing while everyone else got millions. My father tried to look sympathetic, but couldn't hide his satisfaction. Sweetheart, Dad was 91. Sometimes elderly people make unusual choices. I'm sure he had his reasons. I clutched the envelope, my hands trembling. I stood up without a word and left the room with their laughter following me down the hallway. I could hear my mother saying, she's always been so sensitive. Robert probably left her some sentimental jewelry or advice about finding a good husband. In the garden, alone except for the roses grandfather had planted, I finally opened the envelope. Inside was a small piece of paper with a phone number and a single sentence in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting. Call this number at 6 p.m. Don't be late. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just a phone number and a deadline. I stared at the note. My grandfather never wasted words. My watch read 4:47 p.m. I waited in a fog as the celebration carried on inside unnoticed. At exactly 6 p.m., sitting on the stone bench where Grandpa and I used to play chess, I dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a man answered. His voice was deep, cultured, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. Miss Carrington, I've been waiting for your call. I froze. Who is this? My name is Harold Whitmore. I was your grandfather's attorney and closest friend for 43 years. But we have a family attorney, Mr. Williamson. Mr. Williamson handles your family's domestic matters. I handle something entirely different. He paused. Your grandfather kept certain things separate from the rest of the family, Summer. Things he wanted only you to know. My heart was pounding. What kind of things? The kind that can't be discussed over the phone. I've arranged for you to fly to Paris in 3 days. You should receive your tickets and travel documents tomorrow morning. Paris? I can't just fly to Paris. I have work, You have an inheritance to claim, Harold interrupted gently. One that your grandfather spent decades preparing for you. One that nobody else in your family knows exists. The garden suddenly felt very cold. I don't understand.
You will.
Your grandfather was a very careful man, Summer. Everything he did was for a reason, including that note you received today. They all laughed at me, I whispered. My own family laughed because they thought I got nothing. Harold's voice softened. Your grandfather knew they would. He wanted you to see who they really were before you learned the truth. Before you gained the power to change everything. What truth? What power? That's what we'll discuss in Paris. I'll see you Sunday evening, Miss Carrington. I will meet you at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Don't tell your family where you're going. He hung up before I could ask anything else. I sat in the darkening garden, staring at my phone. An attorney my family knew nothing about. A secret kept for decades. A flight to Paris. What had my grandfather been hiding? The next morning, a courier delivered a package to my apartment, the small one-bedroom I rented in Stamford because I couldn't afford Greenwich prices on my entry-level salary. Inside was a first-class ticket to Paris and a black credit card with no spending limit. I barely slept, stunned by everything. Nobody asked what was in my envelope. Nobody seemed to care. Sunday morning arrived gray and rainy. I packed carefully. My best dresses, professional attire, the leather journal my grandfather had given me years ago. The black town car arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. As we drove through the rain-soaked Connecticut countryside toward JFK, I watched my familiar world fade away through the water-streaked windows. At the airport, in the check-in hall, glancing around as I waited in line, an elderly man was playing with his granddaughter, a girl maybe 6 or 7. He handed her a small toy train and she laughed, trying to catch it. The sound made my throat tighten. I remembered my own grandfather doing the same thing, hiding coins in my palm during visits, whispering riddles. The man noticed me watching. His eyes were warm but sharp, assessing. Our gazes met, and my cheeks burned with embarrassment. I'm sorry, I said quietly. You remind me of my late grandfather. He smiled, understanding in his expression. If he loved you, then he never really left.
He tapped his chest.
The ones who matter, they stay here. Shaking off the warmth of the memory, I glanced down at my boarding pass and stepped forward toward the check-in counter, the airport's hum pulling me back to reality. I checked in for my flight. I'd never flown first class before. The first-class seat felt unreal. Champagne was offered as the plane lifted through storm clouds, my chest tight with nerves. The plane lifted off, climbing through the storm clouds into clear sky. I watched America disappear below me and tried to imagine what awaited on the other side of the Atlantic. What had my grandfather built? And why had he chosen only me to inherit it? 11 hours later, the plane touched down at Charles de Gaulle Airport. Paris greeted me with drizzle-scented air and the distant rumble of traffic. As I walked through the arrivals hall, jet-lagged and nervous, I scanned the crowd for some sign, some indication of what came next. Then I saw him. Harold Whitmore stood near the exit, impossible to miss. He was tall, maybe 6'3", with blonde hair streaked with distinguished silver. His suit was impeccably tailored, his posture military straight. But it was his eyes that caught me, sharp, assessing, yet somehow kind. Wrinkles framed them, suggesting he was perhaps in his early 60s, but his presence radiated authority. Miss Carrington. He extended his hand. His handshake was firm, measured, grounding. Welcome to Paris. Mr. Whitmore. Harold, please. He gestured toward the exit. We have much to discuss, but first, let's get you settled. The car is waiting. The car was a sleek black limousine that looked like it belonged to a head of state. As we pulled away from the airport, Harold began asking questions about my flight, my comfort, my career. He listened with an intensity that made me feel truly heard for the first time in weeks. Then, as we drove through rain-slicked streets, he shifted topics. His voice remained calm, but became more deliberate. Did you know, he said, that the Pont Neuf is actually the oldest standing bridge in Paris? Completed in 1607, it has seen more history than most buildings in the city could ever dream of. I looked out at the misty cityscape. The Seine glimmered beneath streetlights, buildings rising like monuments to centuries of human achievement. Your grandfather loved the city, Harold continued. He understood that true legacy isn't built in years, it's built in patience. Something in his tone suggested he wasn't just talking about bridges. We drove for perhaps 30 minutes, leaving the dense urban center behind. The buildings became more stately, the streets quieter. Finally, we turned down a tree-lined avenue where wrought iron gates protected vast estates. "We're here," Harold said simply. The gates before us swung open silently, revealing a driveway paved with perfect cobblestones. Beyond it stood something I'd only seen in architecture magazines, a neoclassical mansion of white stone and golden trim, with multiple wings stretching across manicured grounds. Fountains danced in the evening light. Floor-to-ceiling windows glowed with the soft illumination of crystal chandeliers. My mouth fell open. "Harold, what is this place?" "One of your properties," he said casually. "Your grandfather purchased it 20 years ago. It's been maintained by a full staff ever since." My property?" He nodded. The car stopped at the grand entrance. A valet in crisp livery opened my door immediately. A tall, composed butler appeared as if summoned by magic and bowed slightly. "Welcome home, Miss Carrington," he said in accented English. "I am Francois. If you require anything at all during your stay, you need only ask." Home. I followed Harold inside, overwhelmed by its opulence. Francois disappeared with my luggage. Harold gestured toward the grand staircase. "Your suite is prepared," he said, then paused. "Get some rest. Tomorrow, you'll understand the full truth about who he was and who you're meant to become." Then he was gone, and I was alone in this palace. Francois reappeared to guide me upstairs. The hallway seemed endless, lined with antique furniture and more paintings. He stopped at a set of double doors, opened them with a flourish, and stepped aside. "Your suite, Mississippi." I entered a suite larger than my apartment, with a balcony overlooking the gardens. For the first time, I felt like royalty, unsure why. I sank into a velvet armchair, my legs suddenly weak. For the first time in my life, I was being treated like royalty, and I had absolutely no idea why. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows when I woke. For a moment, I thought I dreamed everything. The mansion, Paris, Harold's cryptic words. Then I opened my eyes and saw the gilded ceiling, the silk canopy, the balcony overlooking gardens that stretched to the horizon. Francois knocked precisely at 8 o'clock. "Breakfast is served in the morning room, Miss Carrington. Mr. Whitmore is waiting." I dressed quickly in professional attire, a navy dress and modest heels. As I followed Francois through the halls, I tried to prepare myself for whatever revelation awaited. But nothing could have prepared me for what Harold was about to show me. He stood when I entered the morning room, which was flooded with natural light. A table was set with fresh pastries, fruit, and coffee that smelled like heaven. But my attention went straight to the leather folder sitting beside his plate. "Good morning, Summer. Please sit." He waited until I was settled before continuing. "I imagine you have many questions, starting with why I'm here and what all of this means." He smiled slightly.
Direct.
"Your grandfather said you would be." He opened the folder and slid it across to me. "Your grandfather didn't leave you a conventional inheritance. He built something far more sophisticated, a structure that only you could access. It's not just money, Summer. It's influence, ownership, and control." I flipped open the folder with trembling hands. The documents revealed a secret empire, global shipping, hotels, real estate, and private equity holding far beyond what my family knew. And I was the primary beneficiary. My hands started shaking so badly, I could barely hold the papers. This has to be a mistake," I whispered. "These numbers are conservative estimates," Harold finished. "Your grandfather spent 4 decades quietly consolidating assets, building partnerships, and structuring everything through shell corporations and international trusts. Nobody in your family knew about any of it. But why? Why keep it secret?" Harold's expression softened. "Because he knew them, Summer. He watched how they treated you, how they dismissed you, overlooked you, assumed you were less capable. He wanted you to see their true colors before you gained the power to change the dynamic. I thought about the will reading, the laughter, my mother's cruel sympathy, Amanda's mocking comment about me not being special. May I show you something? Harold stood and gestured for me to follow him. We walked through the mansion to a private study I hadn't seen before. The walls were covered with maps marked with pins, photographs of properties, business documents spanning decades. And in the center of it all was a timeline, carefully hand-drawn, showing how each acquisition built upon the last. Harold pulled out a photo album. Do you remember the summer you turned 16? Your grandfather sent you to that finance course in London. I nodded slowly. He said it would be educational. You stayed in one of his hotels. He arranged for you to shadow the management team, review their operations, sit in on strategy meetings. You thought it was just a generous vacation. It was training. I breathed. Everything was training. Harold turned pages in the album, showing photos I barely remembered being taken. Memory after memory clicked into place. The seemingly random questions about customer service. The mock contracts he'd asked me to review and critique. The investment scenarios we discussed over chess games. I sank into the nearest chair. Tears blurred my vision. I miss him so much. He knew you would. That's why he left you all of this, not just the properties and the money, but the purpose. He wanted you to have what he'd spent a lifetime building. He wanted you to step into a world where you'd be respected. I wiped my eyes and looked back at the documents. What happens now? Now, Harold said with a slight smile, I show you what you actually own. Harold led me through the mansion's private elevator, an elevator in a house, which seemed absurd until I realized this wasn't really a house at all. It was a headquarters, a symbol of everything my grandfather had built in the shadows. We descended to a secure underground garage. My jaw dropped. Parked in climate-controlled perfection were vehicles I'd only seen in movies. A midnight blue Bentley Continental, a Tesla Model S, a vintage Rolls-Royce that looked museum quality, and at the far end, gleaming on its own raised platform, a Bugatti Chiron in pearl white. These are yours, Harold said simply. Though, I recommend starting with a Tesla. It's more practical for Paris traffic. We returned to the study, where Harold pulled out one final document. Before we go further, there's something you need to know about the terms of your trust. My stomach tightened. What kind of terms? The trust activated on your 23rd birthday, which was 3 weeks ago. But full control doesn't transfer immediately. Your grandfather was wise enough to know that inheriting billions overnight would be overwhelming. So he built in a mentorship period. What does that mean? It means for the next 5 years, until your 28th birthday, you'll learn the business under my guidance. I'll teach you everything your grandfather taught me about managing these assets, navigating international business, understanding the responsibility you've inherited. At 28, full control passes to you. Until then, major decisions require my approval. Relief and frustration warred in my chest. He didn't think I could handle it now. He knew you could handle the money. He wanted to make sure you could handle the pressure. He wanted you to earn this knowledge, not just inherit it. Harold handed me the document, a leather-bound copy of the full trust agreement. Read this tonight. By morning, you'll understand the scope of what you've been entrusted with. And Summer? Your grandfather believed you were capable of greatness. He structured this to ensure you'd achieve it. Over 5 years, Harold trained me in business, preparing me to inherit the empire. On the morning of my 28th birthday, Harold and I sat in the Paris study where we'd spent so many hours. The leather folder before us contained the final documents, the full transfer of control. 5 years ago, Harold said quietly, you sat in this room as a confused young woman who'd been laughed at by her own family. Today, you sit here as one of the most capable executives I've ever known. I had a good teacher. He slid the documents across. Sign these, and Carrington Holdings is entirely yours. No oversight. No approval needed. Complete authority. I picked up the pen, then paused. Then signed the documents with a steady hand. No trembling. No doubt. Just certainty. There's one more thing. I said, pulling out a folder I'd been preparing for weeks. Something grandfather tried to accomplish, but never finished. Harold raised an eyebrow. Go on. Le Méridien Skyline Group. The luxury hotel chain. Grandfather tried to acquire it 20 years ago, but the timing wasn't right. I want to finish what he started. Summer. That's one of the largest independent hotel groups in Europe. The acquisition would be complex. I have a strategy. I told him. Let me hear it then. For the next 2 hours, I walked him through everything. When I finished, Harold was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled that rare, proud smile. Your grandfather would be astonished. And enormously proud. Let's do it. The Le Méridien Skyline acquisition became my obsession for the next 8 months. After intense negotiations, we succeeded in buying majority shares. The press release hit international business, news like an earthquake. Carrington Holdings acquires Le Méridien Skyline Group in $3.8 billion deal. All properties to be rebranded as the Carrington Towers. I was sitting in my Paris office when the news broke. Harold appeared in the doorway with champagne. Your grandfather tried for 20 years to make this happen, he said, pouring 2 glasses. You did it in less than 1. I walked to the window, looking out at the city that had become my second home. Somewhere out there were now 23 properties that bore my family name. My grandfather's dream, finally realized. We did it, Grandpa, I whispered. The towers belong to us. But there was one more thing I needed to do. One final piece of the puzzle that would complete my journey. 3 months later, the invitations went out. Elegant cream cardstock with gold embossing. You are cordially invited to celebrate the unveiling of the Carrington Towers. Join us for an evening of legacy and vision at the Carrington Estate, Paris. Hosted by Carrington Holdings Board of Trustees. Each invitation included first-class round-trip tickets and 5-star hotel accommodations. On Celebration Day, the garden sparkled, music played, and champagne flowed. I watched my family's limousine arrive, their faces a mix of shock and curiosity. Then I descended the grand staircase. The room fell silent. Camera flashes erupted. For a moment, nobody recognized me. I'd changed so much in 5 years. My confidence, my bearing, my presence. Then Amanda gasped. Summer? I smiled, warm and genuine. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm so glad you came. My father's face went pale. Summer? What is this? I gestured to the banners that had just been unveiled across the main hall. The Carrington Towers, a vision fulfilled. Grandfather's last wish, I said simply. He dreamed of this acquisition for 20 years. Tonight, we celebrate that dream, finally realized. My mother grabbed my father's arm for support. Summer, I don't understand. Harold appeared beside me, every inch the distinguished executive. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention. It is my honor to introduce the chairwoman and chief executive officer of Carrington Holdings, Miss Summer Carrington. The applause that followed was thunderous. Business leaders who'd negotiated with me, executives who reported to me, politicians who'd worked with me, all acknowledging who I'd become. My family stood frozen. I explained that Grandpa had entrusted the empire to me. That night, we celebrated not just a business triumph, but his legacy. As the celebration continued, I found my father standing alone on one of the garden terraces. He was staring out at the Paris skyline, his champagne untouched. Dad. He turned. His eyes were red.
Summer.
I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. Yes, I do. He set down his glass. That day, at the will reading, when we laughed, when your mother said those things, when Amanda mocked you, his voice broke. Summer, we were cruel. We were so focused on what we thought we deserved that we never saw what you actually had. It's okay, Dad. I forgive you, I said and walked away. I thought about the girl who'd opened that envelope 5 years ago. The one who'd been laughed at and dismissed. The one who'd felt so small, so overlooked, so worthless. She would barely recognize the woman I'd become. And that, I realized, was exactly the point. I walked to the balcony, stared at the twinkling stars, and a tear dropped down my cheek. My grandfather had given me more than an empire. He'd given me the gift of knowing, absolutely, certainly, without any doubt, that I deserved it. And that, more than any amount of money, was the inheritance that changed everything. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button. Remember, your worth isn't determined by how others see you. It's determined by how you see yourself. The people who underestimate you aren't revealing your limitations. They're revealing theirs. Thank you for joining me on Summer's journey. And never forget, sometimes the greatest gifts come in the smallest packages. You just have to be patient enough to unwrap them.